Welcome back, everyone, to a brand new study. Today, we are absolutely jumping right into the deep end, unpacking the incredibly intricate chronological theories and end times eschatology presented by the Ministry Revealed YouTube channel. This is a fascinating, full summary, deep dive into biblical calendars, and just a quick reminder up front, a link to their original content is below in the description box. So definitely go check that out if you want to explore the source material for yourself. Let's get right into it because the structural mapping we're about to explore is, well, it's incredibly dense, it's mathematically beautiful, and it's deeply, deeply engaging. Essentially, this specific model attempts to solve some truly ancient chronological mysteries by harmonizing three completely separate timekeeping systems. By the time we wrap up here, you're going to see exactly how these wildly disparate prophetic timelines attempt to weave together into one perfectly unified framework. It's like a giant puzzle coming together.
But before we jump headfirst into the complex calendar math, we really need to anchor ourselves, and we do that in Romans chapter 8, verse 18. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. The Source channel makes this really profound point about the heavy, heavy emotional burden of diligently seeking prophecy without actually knowing the exact day or hour. You know, it's a journey of intense dedication, late nights of deep scriptural research, and a type of waiting that can literally ache. The physical and emotional toll of constantly watching the geopolitical and spiritual horizons, it's immense. It is not easy. And because of this incredible dedication, prayers for the Watchmen channels are very much appreciated, and give a hype and like, please. We absolutely must keep seeking and searching faithfully, no matter how exhausting or challenging the wait becomes.
All right, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Watchman's journey, look at how to track time across three distinct calendars, map out the ancient feasts, decode this whole 4 months early mystery, and finally look at the high watch dates for 2027.
Part 1. The Watchman's Journey. So we're beginning by exploring the foundational framework that guides this specific branch of eschatology.
The first absolutely crucial component you need to understand within this framework is the number 50. Now, according to the source's calculations, there is what they refer to as an above period. Basically, this signifies an exact 50-day window, and this specific 50-day period is totally foundational to the whole theory. If you think about biblical numerology and the ancient agricultural cycles, 50 is tied so deeply to Pentecost and the counting of the Jubilee, right? It represents deliverance, release, and the outpouring of the Spirit. In this specific model, it always acts as the immediate runway, the literal starting block that precedes the major tribulation timeline. The source argues pretty strongly that you simply cannot properly calculate the eschatological timeline without first mathematically accounting for this dedicated 50-day transition period. It sets everything else in motion. So this 50-day window always acts as a precursor, leading directly into a highly specific 14-year period of tribulation. And the mathematical symmetry the channel builds here is honestly striking. In this study, those 14 years represent two distinct 7-year periods back-to-back. This ties directly into ancient biblical typologies that we're all familiar with. Think about Jacob serving two 7-year periods for Rachel and Leah, or Joseph dealing with the 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine in Egypt. It frames the time of Jacob's trouble as a rigidly defined block of time. Just as we see days mapped to years throughout various prophetic interpretations, this 50-day lead-up acts as the precise, non-negotiable transition into those 14 very challenging years.
Moving into Section 2, tracking three distinct calendars, this is where it gets really interesting. To uncover the true prophetic alignment, the source material argues that we can't just rely on one single method. We actually need to track biblical time using three completely different systems running simultaneously. And these three systems operate on fundamentally different mechanics. First, we have the calculated Hebrew calendar. This is based on a rigid mathematical algorithm known as the Metonic 19-year cycle. Basically, this system intercalates or mathematically adds 7 leap months over the course of 19 years just to keep the lunar phases aligned with the solar year. Next, we have the physical sighting calendar, often called Ivan's sun, moon, and stars calendar. Unlike mathematical assumptions, this relies on actual real-world atmospheric realities, literally looking up for the physical sightings of the new moon and waiting for the physical ripening of barley in the land. Finally, we have the fixed Ministry Revealed Solstice Calendar, which anchors itself strictly to solar events rather than lunar phases. So we're basically tracking three different types of clocks.
To fully grasp how these harmonize, we have to look a bit closer at the unique mechanics of that MR Solstice calendar. Now, according to the ancient Book of Jubilees, the lunar cycle inherently falls behind the solar cycle by exactly 11¼ days each and every year. It's just a mechanical drift. This fixed solar calendar specifically corrects for that drift. How? Well, April 7th is rigidly locked in as the absolute first day of the year, perpetually realigning everything with the summer solstice. By using this static, mathematically perfect baseline rooted in Jubilees, the channel establishes a reliable control point. They use this to compare against the constantly shifting, drifting variables of both the mathematical Hebrew calendar and the physical sighting calendar. It's the anchor in the storm of timekeeping.
Let's move on to Section 3, Feasts and Prophetic Timelines. Let's look at how ancient biblical feasts serve as much more than just historical traditions. In this model, they act as exact, day-for-year structural roadmaps for the end of days. When decoding the scriptures through this specific lens, the source applies a very strict day-for-year principle, and the mathematics here parallel beautifully. For example, the 7 days of unleavened bread are mapped perfectly to parallel the opening of the seals. 6 days correspond to 6 years of seals, ending with a 7th-year solemn assembly that represents rest. Then, on the other side of the tribulation framework, the Feast of Tabernacles directly parallels the 7 years of trumpets. By applying this structural overlay, the source builds a really comprehensive narrative where every single day of these ancient, multi-day agricultural feasts literally represents an entire year in the macro timeline of the eschatological countdown. Now, this chronological mapping leaves the Feast of Weeks as a crucial missing puzzle piece. According to the source, this specific feast represents the pre-tribulation timeline. It is inherently connected to the gathering of the first fruits of the wheat harvest, which acts as a massive prophetic indicator. But there's more. The study also draws a deep theological connection here to the biblical translation of Enoch. Enoch, as we know, walked with God and was translated or raptured before the Great Flood. So he perfectly symbolizes the pre-tribulation removal of the faithful. Thus, the Feast of Weeks isn't just a simple agricultural marker, it is the definitive triggering event that sets the entire 14-year timeline we talked about earlier into motion. On to Section 4, the 4 months early. To find exactly when this pre-tribulation Feast of Weeks occurs prophetically, we have to solve an agricultural mystery from the Gospel of John.
In John chapter 4, verse 35, Jesus presents a massive anomaly. He tells his disciples, "Say not ye, there are yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest? Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes, and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest." Now the physical wheat harvest usually happens in late spring, but according to the channel's calculations, if you count exactly 4 months backward from that literal, traditional physical wheat harvest, it lands you perfectly on a historical date known as the New Year of Trees, or Tu B'Shvat. This occurs exactly on the 15th day of the 11th month, serving as a stunning, concrete, chronological anchor for the prophetic timeline.
And the source unpacks some really fascinating layers of confirmation to validate this specific 11th month window. First, they look at the biblical typology of Reuben. In ancient traditions, the standard for the tribe of Reuben was a man with a pitcher of water. When you map this to the Mazzaroth, or biblical astronomy, the man bearing water directly corresponds to the constellation Aquarius, which totally dominates the sky during this exact same 11th month. Furthermore, this perfectly aligns with Jeremiah's vision of the blooming almond rod. In Israel, the almond tree is known as the Awakener, because it's literally the very first tree to blossom out of the dead of winter. It begins to awaken and bloom precisely at the new year of trees. So all of these typologies, the agricultural 4-month rule, the astrological sign of Reuben and Aquarius, and the physical blossoming of the almond rod, they all lock perfectly together in this mid-February timeframe. It's incredibly cohesive. Finally, Section 5, High Watch Dates for 2027. By combining the Feast of Weeks, the 4-month rule we just explored, and tracking it all across our 3 distinct calendars, we arrive here. We can now craft a narrative timeline that walks us chronologically right through the spring of 2027. The anticipation begins building heavily in the mid-February watch window, stretching from the 14th to the 22nd. As we established, this perfectly encapsulates the 4 months early rule and the awakening of the almond trees. From there, the timeline crests toward a massive and incredibly rare mathematical alignment in early April. Finally, the sequence culminates in a mid-June window, which aligns with the traditional, literal wheat harvest in the physical agricultural cycle. It is a cascading sequence of highly specific prophetic markers. Now, you might be wondering, when trying to align all 3 calendars in February, a discrepancy actually emerges. Why does the calculated Hebrew calendar completely miss the February 2027 watch date by an entire month? Well, the study explains that this occurs due to the rigid mechanics of that metonic cycle we talked about. The mathematical Hebrew calendar actually delayed adding a 13th intercalary month to their schedule.
However, the physical sun, moon, and stars calendar, which relies on actual atmospheric evidence and the physical ripening of barley in the dirt, had already accounted for that required 13th month the previous year, based on actual physical sightings. This fundamental difference in methodology creates a temporary, one-month schism between the physical reality and the mathematical calculation during the winter watch.
But here is where it gets wild. Despite this temporary winter schism, the source points to a stunning mathematical convergence in the spring. According to their timeline, what they describe as a miraculous catch-up occurs. On April 7th and 8th of 2027, all three entirely distinct calendar systems, the mathematical Hebrew cycle, the physical atmospheric sun, moon, and star system, and the fixed Jubilees MR Solstice calendar, they all fall into exact, unified, simultaneous alignment. I mean, the mathematical odds of these three highly distinct chronological clocks perfectly syncing up on the exact same date is incredibly rare. And that is exactly why the source highlights 2027 as a deeply, deeply pivotal year.
Now, the final layer of this chronological puzzle involves a concept the source calls the Taurus count. To understand this, we have to look way back at ancient historical and astrological context. Currently, the sign of Taurus sits as the third month in the standard calendar. However, the study argues that at the original beginning of creation, Taurus, which is associated with Aleph, the ball, and the beginning of the alphabet, was actually positioned as the very first month. Calculating prophetic time by returning Taurus to its rightful ancient placement as month number 1 honors the true biblical beginning of time and essentially resets the entire prophetic clock. So let's actually walk through the mechanics of this count step by step together. First, you treat Taurus as the absolute starting point, month 1. From that anchor, you calculate forward exactly 7 complete Sabbaths, which is 49 days. When you do this, the source's math elegantly loops right back onto itself. You arrive precisely at the 9th day of Sav. Depending on whether you are tracking a spring or fall count, this perfectly aligns with that 11th month we discussed earlier. The math structurally bridges the original creation calendar directly back to the eschatological timeline of the new year of trees. It's just an incredibly elegant mathematical loop. This Taurus count beautifully echoes ancient extra-biblical texts which present a profound philosophical truth. The quote goes, "Have you discovered then the beginning, that you ought to look for the end? For where the beginning is, there will the end be." In the context of this study, if Christ is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, then finding the literal astronomical beginning of time in Taurus is the absolute essential cipher. By understanding the beginning, the true timing of the end is suddenly revealed. Yet, after all of this, the most crucial takeaway from all these complex calculations is actually a message of steadfast endurance. While 2027 presents incredibly compelling and mathematically elegant alignments across 3 different calendars, the ultimate mission of the watchman is to faithfully persevere without falling into rigid date setting. This brings us right back to the emotional toll we talked about in Romans chapter 8. The mandate is to seek, search, and remain spiritually ready. The watchman must cultivate profound emotional and spiritual resilience, finding real joy and intimacy with the Word during the study itself, regardless of the exact day or hour the timeline is ultimately fulfilled. So, we have journeyed through Jubilee calculations, the intricate mathematics of the Metonic cycle, and the deep typologies of ancient harvests. And I want to end with this provocative thought as we look toward the alignments of 2027. What will you do with the time you have left to prepare? As always, a big thanks for the Gospels Compared members for helping this channel produce fruit. Keep studying, keep watching, and stay focused.